Hey everyone. All right, this assignment for you all at home is a watercolor resist painting. It is not particularly difficult, but it does show you a couple of tips and tricks when using watercolor paint. And it also kind of gets you acquainted with how to use watercolor paint correctly. So you're going to need a piece of watercolor paper, preferably, but any paper is okay. Watercolor paint, water. And for this one, there is one special ingredient, and that is either a white crayon, just Crayola crayon is fine, or a white oil pastel. Sometimes oil pastels are called crayons, but at the end of the day, it just needs to be white and waxy, so whichever that is. All right, let's go. All right, so here are all of our supplies. We have our watercolor paper, or any paper you can find, our white crayon or oil pastel. I'm using oil pastel, but again, you can also use a crayon, it's fine. And I have just a plain old watercolor set. You don't need super expensive watercolor set, water cup, brush, and paper towel. All right, so this painting actually doesn't have any pencil in it at all, no drawing at all. You're going to do all of your shape drawing with this oil pastel. So just to kind of give you an idea about what we're shooting for, is we are going to make a semi-abstract sunset scene using our watercolor paints and our oil pastel. So I wanted to give you a flash of what we're working towards. So the first step is to use our oil pastel to create our shapes, all right, to create our shapes. Now I've created an image in marker what it'll look like, because obviously if I drew white on white paper, you can't see it, right? So I created this marker drawing for you to kind of look at to see what those shapes are going to look like. So again, you're going to draw these shapes on your paper with a white oil pastel. The only reason I'm showing you in marker is because, again, if I drew white on white, you wouldn't be able to see it. So this is a good opportunity to pause your video, but you are drawing kind of like wavy intersecting lines with a circle just slightly above the center. And you're doing all of these shapes in white pastel. So give the video a quick pause and get that drawn. All right, now that you have drawn your shapes in oil pastel, again, the marker was only for demonstration. You should only be using oil pastels. It'll look something like this. You can't see it. So I have drawn in oil pastel my little sunset drawing, and obviously you can't see it on the camera, but it is there. So before we start adding paint, let's scoop this aside. Let's talk about watercolor paint. Watercolor paints are my absolute favorite. I think they're incredibly versatile. I think they're beautiful. Generally, they come in two different types. The type that I have right here is called cake watercolors. They typically dry out, or they don't typically, they dry out in between uses, and will take just a little bit of water right on the surface to kind of get them to wake back up. The other type of watercolor paint, which I am not going to demonstrate because I don't have, are in tubes. So tube watercolor paint obviously has more moisture in it. Which one's better? About the same. It's really preference. I like the cake set one. They do dry out between uses. They're usually a little more portable, but again, that's just personal preference, okay? So my watercolor set has a built-in lid, a built-in tray, so I'm going to use this as my palette. Whenever you open up a cake watercolor set for the very, very first time, you'll notice that if you touch the tops of the paints, they are dry. So you're going to take your paintbrush, and over the colors that you plan on using, just add a couple of drops of water. Just a couple of drops of water. I know it's difficult to see on the camera, but this is not turning into a public swimming pool, okay? Just a couple of little drops to kind of wake that pigment up. And for this painting, we are only going to use the primary and the secondary colors. So red, yellow, blue, and then green, purple, and orange are the ones we're going to use, right? Now, I've been using my paints, so they don't need to sit for a long time. But if your watercolor paints have been up in the closet or in your art kit and are super dry, you might want to add a little water, go get a drink, go to the restroom, and then come back. But the first colors, plural, we're going to use are going to be our warm colors. So warm colors are associated with fire, the sun, those kinds of things. And it is yellow, orange, and red. So we never go from our palette or from our paint tray right here to our paper. Okay, we always make a pit stop on the palette. So I'm going to take my brush, make sure it has a pretty good amount of water on it. I'm going to wiggle it right on the top of that color. And then I'm going to add a little bit to my palette right here. Okay. If you notice when you try to do this, that it all gets back up into the brush and it doesn't leave a puddle, all that means is that you need to add a little bit more water. There needs to be a little bit more water in your brush. All right, so I'm going to get a little more yellow. Then I'm going to get a little orange. And I very well might have to get some more color, but this is a good start. A little red right here. And if you're feeling particularly adventurous, you can make a really, really small, you don't need very much purple at all, little purple puddle right down here, because again, we're doing a sunset up here, and I'll show you where to use that. All right, we are ready to start adding paint to paper. So again, this is my oil pastel drawing where I did the circle and the little wavy lines. I'm going to start with yellow, and I'm going to paint, make sure my brush is rinsed. I'm going to go just yellow, and I'm going to paint my sun yellow. All right. You'll notice, and you can kind of see it in the video, that whenever I try to paint over those oil pastels, it doesn't work. Like the paint kind of pools and sits on top. That's that resist technique. And then just to add a little bit of interest, I want to teach you one of many watercolor techniques, and that's called wet on wet. And that's where you take wet paint and you drop it into a wet surface. So with my sun, I'm going to get just a little bit of orange. Just right around. I'm going to tap, tap, tap. Literally, I'm tapping it. Tap, 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 tap. Tap my brush a little bit of orange. Now, what you'll notice when you put wet paint on top of wet paper, what happens? It doesn't really stay put, does it? It wants to mix and wants to blend. So wet on wet painting is really, really neat because every time you paint something, it'll be a little bit different. Okay, now, since I'm obviously not there with you, wherever you are making your art, the next several decisions are going to have to be kind of on your own. The first decision is generally where you want your horizon line to be. So the horizon line is where the earth meets the sky, and this is going to determine where we paint our water and where we paint our sky. I know you can't see it, but I have a wavy line that runs right here, right below the sun. That is going to be my horizon line. Everything above that is going to be sky. Everything below that is going to be water. And since we have our sky colors already prepped, we're going to paint up. All right, so if you think about a sunset, right? Think about a sunset. You've got all the light is still right around the sun. And as you get further up into the sky, the sun's going away, so it gets darker. So we're going to start light. We're going to start with yellow. So I'm going to paint, let me get a little bit more yellow. I'm going to paint that very first space where I decided my horizon line was yellow. And you can probably tell I am not being incredibly careful. That's one, this painting isn't a detail painting, and two, I've got all these oil pastels to help me kind of stay inside the lines. A little yellow, and why not? Let's add just a little bit of orange. Just a little. We still want it to be nice and light. Okay? As we move up, it's going to get darker. So this next little segment, I'm going to mix yellow and orange to make kind of a darker yellowy color. And just right above that one, I'm going to paint my yellow-orange color. Just like that. When you're painting, if your watercolor paint is super thick and you try to put it on the paper and it's like spreading toothpaste around, you need to add water. Your watercolor should always be kind of the consistency of like Gatorade or Pedialyte. It should be super, super, super runny. So if it's really thick, you need to add a little water. All right, I'm going to keep on marching. So this next one, I'm going to mix a little bit of orange and a little bit of red to make that next color. A little red. Yeah. On my paintbrush. There we go. I like that pretty good. All right, now I'm going to paint a little bit of red. And if you notice, before I paint the red, there's no white, is there? No, some sets that you might have at home do have white, but to make a pigment lighter with watercolor paint, you just add a little bit of water. So to make a pigment darker, you add a little more paint. So I want a dark red. So I need more paint, just like that. Yeah, just like that. And I'm saving that purple, remember that purple pile right here, for this little bitty strip right here. So right above that red, I'm going to take my brush, a little more, a little water, and add some purple. All right, and just like that, we have a nice little abstract sunset. You can see the oil pastels kind of created a barrier, so there's these nice lines that run through, almost mimicking clouds or wind. All right, so I'm going to rinse my brush. I'm also going to wipe out my palette because we are moving to the ocean, okay, where we used mainly warm colors up here. For our water right down here, we're going to use cool colors. Cool colors. So for the cool colors, we need to make a blue puddle. We need to make a green puddle. And then finally, we need to make a good sized purple one this time. Okay, not a little bitty one. All right. So finish your sky. Now we're ready to move on down below. Now with the sky, we had real rules, right? When you paint a sunset, there are rules. As the sun sets on the level with where the sun is, it's still nice and bright, but right around it, that darkness starts to creep in. Well, the water doesn't necessarily have those rules. So right down here, you can paint in any combination you want of these three colors, and I'll show you what I mean. And I actually do this step really fast because because of the way that I do this step. So I'm going to start. You can start with any color you want. In fact, I'm actually going to mix my own custom teal. Teal is just blue and green, and then another blue right down here. I'm going to go in. So what I do is I paint a little of one color. I go with a little bit of just plain old water, and then I'll pick another color. Have them overlapping. Oh, let's do some purple. I'm not being particularly careful. I mean, I'm not being sloppy, right? But I want these colors to kind of mix. So I'm moving quickly so the paper doesn't absorb all my paint. Just straight green in the middle. Blue. Yeah, there we go. That was random. I was picking a color. Picking a color maybe that I hadn't used in a minute. Bam! Told you I do that fast. There's a little bit of a glare because of the wet paint. But again, just like above with the sky, our oil pastels have kind of created these lines for us in our painting that mimic the waves down below. So have fun with this painting. This is not meant to be a serious one. It's meant to mostly get you acquainted with watercolor paints and teach you a couple of techniques. The resist technique, which is the oil pastel, and then also wet on wet painting, because even down here, the colors, we were painting kind of wet paint right on top of each other and overlapping, so you see these colors mixing. So have fun. Be sure to please take a photo and upload these to Google Classroom. And I cannot wait to see what you do.